Chapter 35, Part 2, The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions Continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2 by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman, Chapter 35, Part 2, The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions Continued. With regard to the tempo markings, a distinction exists between the earlier and the later works. In the former, Bach usually indicates the tempo. In the latter, he only does this occasionally, even in the cantatas, the parts of which he has carefully revised. Footnote: among the cantatas partly or wholly provided with tempo indications, we may mention Gottes Zeit, number 106, Du wahre Gott und Davidchen, number 23, Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, number 61, Weinen Klagen, number 12, Selig ist der Mann, number 57, Süßer Trost, number 151, and Mach dich mein Geist bereit, number 115. The tempi are also marked in the B minor Mass and many of the secular cantatas. End footnote. The appropriate tempo for a movement is, as a rule, not hard to find if we examine the text and nature of the music. The old tempi were generally rather too slow, which did some injustice to the more passionate of Bach's movements. Even today, many arias ought to be taken much more quickly than they usually are. A hurried tempo, however, must always be avoided. It should be noted how simple the vocal part is in certain movements of a passionate character. This seems to indicate that Bach wishes them to be taken quickly. Footnote: examples of a very quick tempo will be found in the duet Lass Schiel keine Leiden from Agle dich, o Schiel nicht, number 186, and the arias O Mensch erret deine Schiel from O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort, number 20, and Wirf mein Herz, wirf dich doch from Mein Gott, wie lang, ach lang, number 155. The tempi of the Passions, the B minor Mass, and the Magnificat have been discussed in connection with the analyses of these works. Sometimes the problem of the proper tempo for a movement can only be solved by long experiment. Some movements, again, are enigmas. We shall never be quite clear as to the tempo they require. We may formulate the general principle that the tempo is correct when the details and the ensemble are equally perceptible and equally effective. Here again, as in the clavier and organ works, we must remember that the hearer who is listening to a work of Bach's for the first time often feels a moderate tempo to be a quick one if the modulations are very rich and the contrapuntal writing very complicated. The real difficulty in Bach's music lies not in choosing the tempo but in maintaining it. No one who knows the scores of the cantatas can doubt that Bach demands great elasticity in the tempo, the unity of which, however, must not be impaired. If the hearer perceives the nuances too clearly, he at once gets an impression of unsteadiness and a lack of rhythm. Our singers especially have not sufficiently realized this as yet. Otherwise, their performances would be more frequently satisfactory on the rhythmical side than they are at present. They are particularly at fault in their treatment of the cadences. They draw them out to excessive length and insist too much on even the most unimportant transitional cadences, which results in the arias being torn into separate fragments. The hearer with a sense of rhythm is nervously affected by this. As soon as he scents a cadence coming from afar, he realizes that the tempo will infallibly be slackened, that there will be a discrepancy between the voice and the accompanying instruments, that the orchestra will try to get back to the original tempo in the interludes, and that at the next cadence the game will begin all over again and be repeated 6 or 7 times before the aria comes to an end. The art of transition, of which Wagner speaks in one place, should be the ideal that every Bach singer should keep before him with regard to the tempo. Much will be attained if we can first of all get rid of the mistaken notion that every cadence must be taken in a slower tempo. The next thing desirable is that where rallentandi seem called for in the cadences, they should be applied circumspectly and with moderation. The ensemble of singer and orchestra should never be in the slightest degree impaired. Many rallentandi that seem possible from the point of view of the vocal part are impossible to the orchestra. In this respect, Bach's arias differ from those of the Italians. The orchestra with him does not merely accompany the singer, it is a separate entity. It cannot bow to the caprices of the singers. These must realize that they have to declaim their part expressively to a symphonic orchestral movement, and that the tempo must not vary very much, the effect being rather obtained by the finest nuances of tempo and rhythm. The tempo can be perceptibly varied where the verbal sense requires it. An excellent example of this is the soprano aria Ich folge dir gleichfalls in the St. John Passion. Here the usual rallentandi are wrong, as they negate the joyous urgency of the music. The only justifiable rallentandi are those required by the words Hör nicht auf, selbst an mir zu sehen, zu schreiben, zu bitten. Cease not to draw near to me and pray. The music here depicting the effort of bringing back, but to overdo this rallentando in the least is to endanger the effect of the aria. In Bach's arias it is advisable not to carry a rallentando through to the end, but to lead imperceptibly into the normal tempo again at the conclusion of the cadence, so that when the orchestra enters with the interlude, it has not to fall abruptly into another tempo. Practically, these considerations all amount to this, that the customary stereotyped rallentandi in Bach's music are bad, and that only those are justifiable that proceed from proper reflection upon the musical and poetical nature of the work. This implies that the conductor and the singer should come to an understanding as to the tempo and its variations, and the general conception of the work before, not at, the rehearsal. They must not shrink from long rehearsals and much correspondence. Both will bear rich fruit. Every thoughtful conductor and singer knows to his sorrow that one of the greatest obstacles to a good performance of a Bach cantata or passion is the too limited time devoted to the rehearsal of the solos. Our singers probably sin most against Bach's tempi in the recitatives. They take them much too slowly and with expression in the bad sense of the term, slowing down at each word that they wish to throw into relief, and introducing rallentandi in the cadences at the end of the subordinate sections, so that the hearer gets the impression only of a series of fragments, not of a connected whole. But if the singer aims simply at reproducing the verbal period as Bach has written it, he instinctively avoids any dragging, indulges in no senseless rallentandi, and tries to make his effort chiefly by means of the declamatory prominence of the most characteristic words. This or that section must be sung in a special tempo only when the sense of the text demands it, and in these cases the art of transition must be called into play so as to preserve the general unity of the tempo. No improvement in the delivery of the recitatives is to be looked for until our singers see clearly that they must not so much be sung as spoken with a certain musical feeling. How far the average singer is from this ideal as yet may be seen from the way he renders the recitatives in the Passions. His drawling mode of delivery often prolongs the performance by almost half an hour, but that is the least evil he works. Far worse than this is the fact that he is always depicting instead of narrating, wearies the audience with his false pathos, and neutralizes the effect of the glorious occasional passages in which Bach has given the evangelist a situation to paint. It would be a good thing if our evangelists would now and then recite from memory the story of the Passion. This would save them from many of the stereotyped errors in the delivery of Bach's recitative. The ultimate reason for the unsatisfactory performance of the part of the evangelist is very often the fact that the singer does not know the story of the Passion by heart. If Bach employs two themes in a movement, the artistic problem is to ensure to each its proper tempo without destroying the unity of the general tempo. The charm and the difficulty of this problem may be realized from a study of the first chorus of Ihr werdet weinen und heulen, number 103. There are many choruses in which Bach has expressly marked more tempi than one. Footnote. For example, the first choruses of Der Himmel lacht, die Erde jubilieret, number 31, Allegro, Adagio, Allegro, and Jesu nun sei gepreiset, number 41, in which Bach has marked the two middle sections, Adagio and Presto. In the choruses of his youthful works he almost always prescribes more than one tempo, as in these cantatas he is specially bent on composing the text line by line. In the analysis of the B minor Mass, examples are given in which the tempo of a movement is the product of a contest between two different motives. End footnote. It goes without saying that the middle section of the choruses and arias should be taken a shade faster or slower than the main sections, conformably to the sense of them. It is certain also that we can allot a special tempo to this or that segment of a passage. In the final chorus of Christen adstet diesen Tag, number 63, Bach himself has marked the words aber niemals lass gesgessen, Adagio. Markings of this kind, however, give no warrant for the capricious rallentandi merely designed for effect, by which certain conductors think they lend an added interest to Bach's music even in the chorales. Where Bach has sharply contrasted two motives in obedience to the poetic idea, it would be wrong to tone down the antithesis by passing gradually from the one tempo to the other. In the final aria with chorus of the cantata Halt im Gedächtnis Jesum Christ, number 67, a rallentado in the concluding bars of the passages that are constructed on the tumult motive must necessarily weaken the effect of the entry of the peace motive in the wind instruments. Even a diminuendo is out of place here. The more abrupt the transition is, the better. The instrumental basses must still give out the last bar of their tumult motive forte, even after the wind have entered piano. In the antiphonal cries again of the chorus Vol uns and O Herr, there should be no gradual mediation between the two tempi. The question of ornaments presents no special difficulty with regard to the cantatas and passions, since Bach almost always adopted the principle of writing out in full the complicated or even the simple ornaments. The signs he employs are to be interpreted in the light of the general principles laid down by Emmanuel, Quantz, and Turk on this subject. Footnote. See the detailed exposition of Bach's ornamentation in Volume 1. Rust discusses the ornaments of the cantatas in particular in the preface to BG 7. End footnote. As a rule, the trills are taken too quickly and irregularly. Our instrumentalists find a strange difficulty in entering into the spirit of Bach's style. It would be as well if the conductors would write out the signs in full in the orchestral parts. This would, at any rate, ensure a certain uniformity in the performance, which at present is sadly lacking, in spite of all explanation. Too much importance cannot be attached to a simple and quiet rendering of the trills. The following mode of realization may be suggested for the trills in the bass accompaniment to the aria Mein teurer Heiland in the St. John's Passion. Very often the context shows that the trill is best realized as a simple prautrille. An example may be seen in the oboe duet in the aria Sehet Jesu hat die Hand in the St. Matthew Passion. As many of the trills that Bach has marked are barely possible or quite impossible on the woodwind of today, and must have been even more so on the imperfect instruments of that period, Rust conjectured that the sign T or TR in these cases signified a kind of tenuto. This hypothesis can hardly be maintained. On closer examination, we get the impression that by the trill sign, Bach very frequently intended the single or double prautrille. In any case, the acceptance of this view might solve many difficulties. As regards the realization of the ornaments in the violin solo of the aria Erbarm dich in the St. Matthew Passion, it is first of all to be observed that the opening bars, according to the score and the parts, are not written, but, since in the vocal part of the aria Was willst du dich mein Geist entsetzen, from Liebster Gott, wann werd ich sterben, number 8, the score has the sign and the voice part has the small notes. This realization of the sign may probably be regarded as authentic. Footnote. The BG editors have made the mistake of printing the realization in the text and the authentic sign in the preface instead of vice versa. In the aria Ach schlafig Ziel from Mach dich mein Geist bereit, number 115, and in other places, the BG edition rightly prints End footnote. The only question is whether Bach meant this slur to be part of the beat or to be regarded as a portamento outside the beat, between the F sharp and the D. The former is the more natural, but in the later part of the solo we meet with passages of this kind, in which the slur is written out. It is therefore a probable assumption, and one that has been put forward by connoisseurs, that Bach's notation in the opening bar implies another kind of slur not included in the beat. Footnote. Stockhausen, for example, held that the Bach slur must not always be included in the beat. Whether this opinion can be historically justified is doubtful. End footnote. There ought to be little difficulty in coming to an agreement as to the difference between the long and the short Vorschlag in this movement. The long Vorschlag are merely those that come before a dotted or undotted crotchet. All the rest are short. It goes without saying that in each case the accent falls on the small note of the Vorschlag. The appoggiatura, in the narrower sense of the term, gives unnecessary trouble to inexperienced singers. It is well known that in the vocal cadence Bach and his contemporaries did not write the falling second or the falling fourth as such, but wrote the final note twice, or the equivalent of twice. The following recitative in the St. Matthew Passion
Dreimal verleugnen
must therefore be sung thus,
Dreimal verleugnen
and the following passage
Nicht alle seid
thus.
Nicht alle seid.
This method of notation, in which, as in the Hebrew krekitib, we have to read something else than what is written, is explained by the reluctance of the old musicians to write out retardations in full. For the same reason, they wrote the Vorschlag thus, instead of thus. The laws of euphony were not extended to the I. The appoggiatura in the narrower sense is therefore simply a matter of the three Vorschlag involved in a vocal cadence. It was not noted in the ordinary way, but omitted altogether, in order that the organist or cembalist who had the voice part written out partially or in full above his figured bass, might not be put out by the retardation when he came to play his final chord. The terrors that this method of notation has for the laity vanish as soon as the reason for it is explained. It should be observed that nowadays it is not the custom to take every interval of a third in a vocal cadence, as an appoggiatura, by the mediation of the second. Julius Stockhausen, for example, very often disregarded the appoggiatura in a transitional cadence. Footnote: I owe this information to Herr Theodor Gerold, teacher of singing in Frankfurt, who was associated for many years with Stockhausen in his teaching work. End footnote. Many singers think it necessary to distinguish between two short verslages, an accented and an unaccented one, that is, one not taken in the beat. The authentic traditions of the 18th century seem to give no warrant for this view, and practical experiment will show that the short accented Vorschlag is always more natural in its effect than the unaccented one. It is still a matter for investigation whether the rule that the trill must begin with the subsidiary note holds good without exception in Bach's vocal music. The answer would probably be in the affirmative. In certain cases, the trill commencing with the principal note may have a charm of its own. As a rule, however, we should render it in the traditional way more frequently than is the custom now. It is hardly credible that Bach conceived the vocal trill differently from the instrumental. Every singer is bound to be pleased with the result when he takes the trill in the correct way. A particularly good method is to pause slightly on the principal note before beginning the trill with the subordinate note, and then gradually increase the tempo. Thus. On short notes, the sign TR mostly indicates only a pralltrilla or a double pralltrilla. For the dynamics of Bach's vocal music, the following works may be recommended for study. The secular cantatas Schleicht spielen die Wellen, BG 20, and O holder Tag, BG 29, and the church cantatas Ach ich sehe jetzt, da ich zur Hochzeit gehe, number 162, Herr und Mund und Tat und Leben, number 147, Mein liebster Jesu ist verloren, number 154, Schauet doch und sehet, number 46, Herr gehe nicht ins Gericht, number 105, Liebster Gott, wann werd ich sterben, number 8, Ich bin vergnügt mit meinem Glücke, number 84, Christus, der ist mein Leben, number 95, Erfreut euch, ich Herzen, number 66, Am Abend aber desselbigen Sabbats, number 42, Es wartet alles auf dich, number 187, Süßer Trost, mein Jesus kommt, number 151, Liebster Jesu, mein Verlangen, number 32, Ich elender Mensch, number 48, Ich freus mich in dir, number 133, Gelobet seist du, number 91, Das neugeborn Kindlein, number 122. Among these movements are some in which Bach distributes forte, piano, and pianissimo in the subtlest way. For example, the first chorus of Das neugeborn Kindlein, number 122, and the arias in Ich freu mich in dir, number 133, and Es wartet alles auf dich, number 187. As a rule, however, he is content with simple alternations of forte and piano. In the majority of the arias, the nuances mean very little, since the piano in the orchestral parts merely indicates the entry of the voice. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to think that Bach wished for no more nuances than he has usually marked. proof to the contrary may be had in the movements which he has liberally sprinkled with forte, piano, and pianissimo. Moreover, we must always remember that he revised his parts only for his personal use, not for publication or for performances by other people. Footnote. The scores contain no indication for phrasing and no dynamic marks. Even the figuring of the continuo is omitted. How Bach marked the parts when it was a case of performance by someone else may be seen from the Kyrie and Gloria of the B minor Mass. The phrasing is indicated in the most precise way, while the dynamics are merely suggested. End footnote. He relied principally on verbal directions. Nor must we forget that singers and players, being constantly engaged in performing his works under his own direction, were intimately acquainted with his intentions, and would do the right thing of their own accord. These considerations determine our own course of action with regard to the parts in a performance. Whatever authentic marking exists must be attended to, but beyond this we can venture upon many things which must not be regarded as unauthorized, though they are not written in the parts, for they correspond to what Bach would tell his players by word of mouth. The parts must accordingly be elucidated and explained. The nuances that Bach has marked must be carried out, as in the clavier works and the Brandenburg concertos, with a certain abruptness. He loves the immediate antithesis of forte and piano. Generally speaking, he does not provide for the transition of one into the other by means of a diminuendo or crescendo. This is especially true with regard to the arias. The orchestral preludes and interludes must be played in a solid forte. At the entry of the voice, the instruments suddenly pass into piano. This abrupt transition cannot be successfully managed at the first attempt. Some practice in it is required. No conductor, however, will regret making the attempt to get his orchestra to enter into the spirit of the old tradition. Moreover, this is the best way of weaning the instrumentalists from the false kind of rallentandi. It has the further advantage that a number of transitional bass figures that were formerly lost in the diminuendo now make their proper effect. Among the peculiarities of Bach's dynamics which can be studied in the parts that he has so carefully marked with nuances are the echo effects. He often introduces, by way of contrast, 2 or 3 pianissimo bars where it would not occur to us to do so. At the first glance, the device seems artificial and pedantic, but as many themes and passages are calculated on it, it is one of the most natural and most telling effects that we can introduce into the accompaniment of the arias. As has been already mentioned, the players in Bach's time probably rendered these passages by slackening the hairs of the bow. The curious change of timbre obtained in this way, unfortunately, cannot be obtained with the modern bow. Bach gives us no indications as to the nuances he employed in the arias after the entry of the voice. He would regard this as belonging to the province of correct declamation. He would certainly permit every crescendo and diminuendo that was needed to give expression to the words. All nuances, therefore, that have a natural musical or poetical justification may be regarded as not only permissible but necessary. From the character of Bach's music it is clear that nothing could be more odious to him than a lifeless delivery of an aria. The more dramatically it can be sung, the better. Even the purely lyrical movements in the cantatas gain in performance by the infusion of a certain inward vivacity. In proportion, however, as the singer attains to a more profound conception of the text, will he adopt a simple style of performance. Many an effect that he thought fine at first will come to seem bad and factious as he understands the music better. If the singer articulates clearly and declaims with natural feeling, and the instrumentalists, even when they are playing piano, put life into their phrasing and accentuation, the dynamic problem solves itself. It will be observed that in Bach the question is generally not one of long periods of crescendo and diminuendo, but of throwing single words into high relief, notwithstanding that examples can be adduced in which the guiding idea of the music has apparently been an increase or decrease of tone. Perhaps it is not superfluous to remind singers that it is always bad to force the voice in performing Bach. Good Bach singers are comparatively rare. The majority fail because they lack the necessary technical foundation. Their conception may be right, but their voices are not fully obedient to them. The often repeated opinion that Bach's works do not need the bel canto is utterly false. They need this, but something more as well. It would be well for every Bach singer to devote some time to acquiring the lightness that is aimed at in the Italian and French schools, for which an acquaintance with good Italian vocal music is indispensable. It must not be forgotten that Bach formed himself on the Italian style of singing and presupposes this in his music. Present-day singers, as a rule, perform it too heavily. To this external art of singing has to be added the other art of natural poetic declamation that is so necessary in German music. Bach's coloratura has really hardly anything in common with that of the Italians. It is not an end in itself, but the servant of the declamation, which makes it harder, not easier. The singer must be superior to every technical difficulty if he is to render the runs simply and with a certain naturalness that is indispensable to their proper effect, for they should not impress us as coloratura, but as a fine enunciation. In passages of this kind, a certain urgency of tempo is preferable to dragging. The directness of delivery that suits Bach's music so well really demands a perfect technique. Few of our singers, apparently, realize the mischief done by inappropriate crescendi, or they would not prolong so unnaturally and embellish as they do every sustained note, even the shortest. In Bach's arias and recitatives we should not be conscious of the art of singing as such, no matter how indispensable it may be. On the contrary, the singing should be fresh, ingenious, and youthful in the best sense of the word. It should not be forgotten that the parts were written, without exception, for boys and very young singers. Bach's style was naturally influenced by the fact that these were the only interpreters he had at his disposal. The feminine delicacy with which very many of our singers render the arias is therefore foreign to Bach's ideas and does harm to his music. It is to be hoped that a time will come when more attention will be paid than at present to the natural lightness of the boy's voice, and more use made of boy singers in performances of Bach. We shall then probably find that the current prejudice as to the inexpressiveness of a boy's singing is not justified. Has not every musician discovered from his own experience that his artistic sensibility developed in an extraordinary way from his 12th to his 15th year, and that later on he had to acquire afresh what at that time came naturally to him? Why should boys at that age merely play the piano well? Why should they not achieve something in the much more natural art of song? Everyone who has studied Bach's scores carefully knows that there are many movements in them that can never be fully effective except with the freshness and the timbre of the boy's voice. Perhaps the day will come when we shall once more hear the soprano cantata Geauchzet Gott in allen Ländern, No. 51, again sung by the fresh voice of a boy. That beautiful boys' voices are the ideal for the Bach choruses will not be disputed by anyone who has heard a good boys' choir in one of the cantatas. Schreck has shown, with the St. Thomas boys of today, what can be done with an ensemble of this kind. The advantages of the boys' choir are the natural ease of the voices in the higher register, the clarity of the timbre of the soprano and alto, and above all, the homogeneity of the voices as a whole. The glorious outlines of Bach's alto parts cannot be followed properly except in a boys' choir. The difficulties of getting boys to perform Bach must not be overrated. The easier cantatas can be given by any good college choir after careful rehearsal. Certain of the secular cantatas, such as Der Zufriedengestellte Lillis, seem to be written for a choir of this kind. Perhaps the practice of Bach's works will bring about a new era in the rather sorry state of singing in our high schools. The conductor who has a few good boys' voices in his choir should use them to support the women's voices. It cannot be too strongly urged that the cantus firmus of the chorales, even in the chorale arias, should always be sung by boys. Anyone who has heard boy sopranos in the introductory choruses of the chorale cantatas can hardly imagine them again without these. Not many voices are required. Half a dozen of them, together with the women's voices, are sufficient to bring out the melody in broad, plastic lines. Boys' voices are very effective, again, in the canti fermi of the final chorales. There need be no fear that they will impair the fineness of the expression here, as will be evident to anyone who makes the experiment rationally. On the contrary, it is a matter for wonder that we have been so long satisfied to have the chorale melodies sung by women's voices that lack the full, penetrating, objective tone that is here required. There is still considerable difference of opinion as to the best way of rendering the final chorales. One view is that they should be given a cappella, without the accompaniment for strings and oboes that Bach has indicated or presupposed, to which the flutes and even the bass may sometimes be added. It is urged that Bach's purpose was merely to support his rather inefficient singers, and that our large modern well-trained choirs can dispense with this assistance. It would be a pity if this view should gain ground. There is a great danger in the a cappella performance of the chorales by a large choir. It is very easy to achieve falsity by exaggerating the dynamic shadings. It is indisputable that a great effect can be made on an audience by 400 voices delivering one line of a chorale fortissimo and the next in a hardly audible pianissimo. But it is almost equally indisputable that this is not the right way. The simple and beautiful outlines of the chorale melody are lost in these mighty crescendi and decrescendi, the rallentandi that they almost of necessity bring with them, and the long holding of the fermate for the sake of effect. We lose the sense of the chorale as a whole and only perceive the fragments. What should we say if any other simple melody was sung by a chorus in the same coarsely effective style? Yet it is permitted in chorales which are not only simple, but full of piety. For these exaggerated nuances we should substitute a simple but impressive declamation, studiously avoiding anything like sentimentality or excitement. The choir should almost speak rather than sing, the dynamic shadings being obtained, as it were, within a gamut of a sharply defined recitation. Care should be had with regard to the endings of words and of sentences. The fermate should be no more than natural breath pauses, short or long as the sense of the line requires. This method will bring us nearer artistic truth than the present style. If after this the chorale does not affect the audience, it will at all events give it a deeper artistic conception of the nature of the sacred melody. In a performance of this kind, the instruments are neither a hindrance nor a superfluity, but a necessity. Footnote: the instruments must cooperate in places where they are not prescribed in the BG edition. If they are not indicated in the chorale, this simply means that the parts of the cantata are lost. Bach comparatively rarely marks the instrumentation of the final chorale in the score, and does not even take the trouble to write the text in there, often inserting no more than the first line. End of footnote. They afford a golden background for the declamation. They work out the melodic outlines and permit the voices to attend almost exclusively to the clear delivery of the text. It should be noted that the harmonies in Bach's chorale movements aim not so much at large dynamic effects as at bringing out separate words and syllables. The enunciation of our large choirs in pianissimo passages is often very defective, the audience hearing neither singing nor speaking, but only a confused murmur, which cannot be agreeable even to an uncritical hearer. These views must not be taken to mean that under no circumstances must the chorales be sung a cappella by large or small choirs. There are occasions when it would be wrong to throw away the opportunities thus afforded for a striking effect. Each case of the kind, however, should be able to show its own justification. For the rest, we should never approach the problem of the performance of Bach's music in a narrow-minded spirit. End of chapter 35, part 2. The performance of the Cantatas and Passions. Chapter 35, part 3. The performance of the Cantatas and Passions continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2 by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman, Chapter 35, Part 3, The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions, continued. It is often debated whether large choirs are an advantage in the Cantatas and Passions. It is hardly possible to give an unequivocal answer. It is obvious that Bach's music, with its complicated polyphony, does not aim at the same massive effects as Handel's. It would even be easy to name a number of works that, for purely external reasons, call for a choir of only moderate dimensions. The cantatas, that is to say, in which Bach employs a solo violin or solo oboe with the chorus. In other words, internal considerations forbid the use of a large choir. By their very essence, they are a kind of sacred chamber music. The works in which Bach wrote simply for the choir, usually at his service, with 3 or 4 voices to a part, are really much more numerous than is generally supposed. Further, it must be acknowledged that even Bach's largest and most powerful choruses are extremely effective with a small choir of really good voices, say 6 or 8 to a part. Julius Stockhausen's experiences in this way with a choir of his pupils in the St. John Passion are extremely encouraging. The desire to hear Bach's works more frequently with the original equipment is therefore well justified. It is certain that his polyphony shows to the best advantage under these conditions. On the other hand, it would be a mistake to deny that there is some reason in and some justification for our large choirs, to which we have become so accustomed, and which are often called for by the size of the building in which we are giving Bach's work. Bach indeed never dreamed of a performance of the Gloria, the Et Resurrexit, and the Hosanna of his B minor Mass by 300 or 400 singers. Nevertheless, we may venture to perform them in this way, and it has been done successfully. We ought to recognize, however, that it is all a matter of chance. Even with a choir of 150 voices, there is a danger of the lines of the vocal polyphony coming out too thickly and heavily in a way directly opposed to the nature of Bach's music. Audience and conductors often show in this regard a happy simplicity and modesty. They are satisfied with choral performances that are really more like a confused din than the polyphony of Bach, and that have not even the saving grace of mechanical precision. Siegfried Och has conclusively shown that this danger can be avoided and that the same clarity, precision and delicacy can be obtained with large choirs as with small. In this respect, the performances of the Berlin Philharmonic are an event in the history of Bach interpretation. With our large choirs, the dynamic nuances necessarily seem more sharply defined than in performances on the scale of those of Bach himself. In reality, only the broad and simple dynamic plans can come out. The conductor discovers, in the case of almost every work, that when the orchestra and organ enter, he has to resign himself to the loss of many interesting nuances that he had set his heart on at rehearsal. In the choruses, as in the chorales, the range of dynamic possibilities is finely limited by the vivacity of the declamation. Opportunities for the usual big crescendi and decrescendi are not too plentiful. There is no excuse, however, for introducing nuances for the mere sake of variety. On the other hand, the more we work at Bach, the more convinced we become of the importance of clear enunciation down even to the finest detail. A certain martellato, used with discretion and in moderation, is very effective in the coloratura, as it brings them out more clearly than the customary strict legato, in which the successive notes flow smoothly one into the other. The least exaggeration, however, is bad. If the choir can declaim well, and the orchestra phrase and accent well, the hearer will feel no desire for a number of pronounced dynamic shadings. The leading of the voices, if it be sufficiently spirited, compensates for everything. The piling up of the parts produces a crescendo, and a natural decrescendo comes as they diminish in number. False nuances frequently have no other effect than to obscure for the hearer the natural dynamic impression that Bach's polyphony ought to give him. Special care must be taken not to pursue any dynamic chimeras in the opening choruses of the chorale cantatas. Bach gives hardly any direct dynamic instructions in his choruses. Valuable hints for forte and piano can be had, however, from a consideration of the instrumental parts. If the full orchestra cooperates, the movement is usually meant to be taken forte. If this wholly or partially ceases, the movement is generally intended to be piano. As a rule, the greater crescendo and diminuendo, which we are inclined to get dynamically, are produced by Bach by adding or subtracting instruments, that is, by increasing or diminishing the number of obbligato parts. This fact is of great importance for the proper interpretation of his scores. In the cantatas, Bach often uses, as in the Brandenburg concertos, a tutti and a solo ensemble, not only in the orchestra but in the chorus. As a rule, he would say verbally when the ripieno players were to enter or leave off. Fortunately, however, some indications of this kind are found in the parts. He desires the alternation of the solo and the tutti, for example, in the opening choruses of Die Himmel erzahlen, number 76, Ich glaube lieber Herr, number 109, and Gott ist mein König, number 71. In the chorus Was bedrückst du dich, from Ich hatte viel Bekommennis, number 21, and in the chorus Alles nun was ist wohl, from Ein ungefahrt Gemüt, number 24. For the first chorus of Unser Mund sei voll Lachens, number 110, he even writes out special ripieno vocal parts. If he thus worked with two tonal masses with the small choirs he had at his disposal, how much more would he have done with the large choirs we have today? The piano and forte obtained by stronger or softer singing can never replace those resulting from the increase or diminution of the number of voices. The latter means is the more natural one, where the effect desired is not one of transition, but of the contrast of tonal degrees. It achieves this excellently. The leading of the voices comes out much more clearly in a piano of a small choir singing with moderate force than in the sustained pianissimo of a large choir, where indeed it is often far from distinct. Bach aims at effects of this kind. Why do we always fight shy of them? In any case, there is one thing we should insist upon, that in the middle movements of the choruses, where the instruments are silent, only a portion of the choir shall sing. The effects to be made in the fugues by means of successive increases of the number of voices at decisive entries, and in the lyrical choruses, such of those of Du Herte Israel, number 104, and Liebster Emmanuel, number 123, by means of the alternation of various choral masses, and the effect of shadings of this kind in the large choruses of the festival cantatas, all this offers a rich field for interesting experiment. The absurdities that follow from the continual employment of a large chorus in the Passions have already been mentioned. In the chorales the best effect is often obtained by the use of some 30 or 40 good voices. On the other hand, it may be argued that not all the movements which we regard as solo numbers were allotted to soloists by Bach himself. For him, solo singing and choral singing passed over into each other in a way to which there is no parallel now. We must remember that his choristers were soloists, and his soloists were choristers. The best of them were skilful in coloratura. Perhaps it is not too hazardous a view to take that, as boys' voices blend so well, he did not scruple to have solos sung by 2, and if necessary 3, of his choristers. We sometimes wonder how he could orchestrate an aria or a duet in such a way that the best singers cannot hold their own against the orchestra. Footnote: who can boast that he has ever heard the opening duet of O Eeuwigheid du Donnerwoord, number 60, even fairly well done? A glance at the score shows that it can never be sung properly by any 2 voices, even those of the best singers. End footnote. Is the solution of the enigma to be found, perhaps, in the doubling of the solo voices? Anyone who has happened to hear boys' voices in a church without seeing the singers will have observed that it is almost impossible to say whether solo passages are being taken by 1 or 2 voices. Voigt rightly remarks, when discussing from the practical standpoint the possibility of allotting the solo numbers to more than 1 voice, that Bach's solos do not express individual sentiments as opposed to the general sentiments of the chorus, and that they should not be allotted to definite individual singers. Footnote: W. Voigt, Erfahrungen und Ratschläge bezüglich der Aufführung Bachscher Kirchenkantaten in the Bach Jahrbuch for 1906, pages 1 through 42. End footnote. It will not be denied that the opening duet of the Easter Oratorio, BG 21, presupposes a choral performance, that a number of simple duets and trios in the latest cantatas give one the same impression, and are certainly more effective when sung by several voices, has already been argued in connection with the discussion of these works. Footnote: see, for example, the simple but splendid duets and trios in the cantatas Allein zu dir, Herr Jesu Christ, number 33, Aus tiefer Not, number 38, Du Friedfürst, Herr Jesu Christ, number 116, Gott der Herr ist schön und schild, number 79, Meinen Jesum lass ich nicht, number 124, Mit Fried und Freud fahr ich dein, number 125, Mein Schiel erhabt den Herrn, number 10, Herr Jesu Christ, du hochster Gut, number 113, Jesu, der du meine Schiel, number 78. End footnote. The understanding of the scores is of the greatest importance for the orchestral parts. The piano in the instrumental parts of the arias not only means that at the entry of the voice the orchestra is to play softly, but the ripieno also has to cease. Thus, the instrumental piano also is obtained by a diminution of the number of the players. This natural use of the tutti for the preludes and interludes, and the senza ripiene for the accompaniment to the voice, is coming slowly into acceptance. It is beginning to be recognized how much more effective is the piano obtained by the use of a few instruments, as compared with the pianissimo playing of a larger number. It carries better, it is capable of more modulation, the leading of the voices is quite clear. As there is no need to play pianissimo, a normal tone strength being all that is required, we can get better phrasing and accentuation. The nuances also can be made more pronounced. At first, this kind of accompaniment strikes the hearer as curiously thin. He soon becomes accustomed to it, however, and is pleased to have lost his perpetual fear that the voice is about to be submerged by the orchestra. In the halls in which we are accustomed to perform Bach, however, it is not advisable to employ too few instruments. For string accompaniments, the following will be found best as a rule: 2 desks for the first and second violins and violas, and 1 desk each for the cellos and double basses. Footnote: at a very interesting performance of the St. Matthew Passion in the cathedral at Basel in 1906, I observed that many of the instrumental parts did not come out, there being too few desks of them for the space. This was especially noticeable in the accompaniment to the music of Jesus. In other passages, however, the advantages of the principle were fully manifested. End footnote. In the accompaniment of a recitative in Ich liebe den Horsten, No. 174, Bach prescribes 3 string instruments to each part. The piano, however, does not merely signify that the ripieno instruments concerned are to cease. It refers also to the instruments in the tutti that have been playing the same parts. In the opening number and in the duet Ich hab's wo mir ein schwer Reis from Ach Gott wie manches Herzeleid, No. 58, the 3 oboes in the tutti passages play with the strings. In the passages where the voice enters, they are marked tacet, the strings alone accompanying. The 3rd oboe goes to the support of the soprano, which sings a chorale. There is a similar case in the alto aria in Süße Trost, mein Jesu kommt, No. 151. This is accompanied by the oboe d'amore. In the tutti passages, however, this part is played by the whole of the violins and violas. In the first chorus of Was frag ich nach der Welt, No. 94, Bach, in order to get certain echo effects, sometimes makes the oboes play with the violins and sometimes silences them. It is a mere accident that these indications have come down to us. Bach has for once entered into the parts the instructions he was accustomed to give by word of mouth. In arias in which the oboes and violins play in unison, piano probably often means that either the wind or the strings are to cease. This rule may be tested in the cantatas Ich will den Kreuzstab gern tragen, No. 56, and Ich armer Mensch, ich Sündenknecht, No. 57, in the opening numbers of which, according to the Bach Gesellschaft editions, the oboes should play from beginning to end with the strings, whereas, as a matter of fact, the voices ought probably to be accompanied only by the strings, or only by the wind, or by the one or the other in turns. In the aria Sanfte sol mein Todeskummer from the Easter Oratorio, BG 21, the violins are doubled by the flutes à bec in the octave. It is more than doubtful, however, whether Bach had the flutes played throughout, or whether they ceased in the accompaniment to the voices. The fact that the parts of the instruments that merely double others in the tutti are written out in full is only an apparent contradiction of the views here advanced. The obligato parts were copied out. The conductor would say to what extent the instrument in question was to play from them. It was only in rare cases that separate parts were made for the ripieno instruments. The false conclusions to which we can be led by a literal following of the score and its markings may be seen in connection with the bassoon. At the beginning of one cantata is a note to the effect that the bassoon is to play with the cellos. To do this throughout the movement would be a gross error. It merely means that the bassoon must cooperate in the chorus and now and then in the tutti of a strongly scored aria. On the other hand, the absence of any indication as to the cooperation of the bassoon does not imply that we are not to employ it to strengthen the basses, at any rate in the choruses. In the majority of choruses it is really essential, and if the choir is a large one, it is as well to employ not merely one, but 2 or 3 bassoons. It should even be used in the tutti passages of the aria where it will be effective, at any rate wherever the violins and violas are reinforced by the woodwind. We may venture upon still other courses that are not indicated either in the score or in the parts, but which were probably pursued by Bach himself. We must consider the circumstances at the performances in St. Thomas's. It was a case of doing with the smallest possible number of written parts. Even in the choruses there was usually only one copy for each vocal part. The instrumentalists mostly played standing. They half knew their parts by heart. Thus, it was quite practicable for other instruments to play at times from the same part in the tutti of the arias. When the Bach-Gesellschaft edition indicates an oboe accompaniment to an aria, this does not always imply that the part is to be played by merely one oboe from beginning to end. We may be sure that when Bach had 1 or 2 oboes at his disposal, he did not let them remain idle, but made them join in the tutti when he came to a vigorous theme. Nor is it unlikely that he supported the oboe with 2 or more string instruments, which would play in the tutti from the same part. Even these historical considerations are unnecessary. Often the music itself shows that in the tutti of the arias that were accompanied by the wind, the solo instruments were either doubled or supported by strings, or both. We cannot help feeling it to be ridiculous when a bold and proud theme is suggested rather than actually given out by a single oboe or flute. Every assistance is permissible, and indeed imperative, that makes the obbligato part more effective, for it is of the part, not the instrument, that Bach thinks in the first place. 2 oboes are prescribed for the instrumental duet that accompanies the choral aria Und was der ewig güt'ge Gott, in Wahrlich ich sage euch, No. 86. But even the best players cannot perform these haughty runs in such a way that the introduction has its desired effect. For the tutti, therefore, we must double the oboes and add the whole of the violins. It is to be observed that in many themes that are marked for oboes alone, the phrasing is so string-like in quality that the right grouping and accentuation of the notes are quite impossible without the cooperation of the violins. Thus, in the tutti passages of the opening numbers of Sie werden euch nicht nehmen tun, No. 44, and the first aria of Jesu nun sei gepreiset, No. 41, for example, we may add the strings in the oboe duet and the oboe trio. Footnote. Another case that justifies the support of the oboe by the strings is the chorale aria Wellet will ich dir geben, in Christus der ist mein Leben, No. 95. It should be mentioned, too, that in large halls the strings may also be sometimes used to advantage with the oboes in the vocal accompaniments when there is no danger of the voice being drowned. End footnote. It is frequently necessary to add the strings in the tutti passages, even in an aria for solo oboe. How much has to be added to the received scoring may be seen from the arias in which, according to Bach's score, the oboes are to play with the first and second violins. We may reasonably wonder why he leaves the violas without the support of the taille, which, with Bach, takes the place of the third oboe. He, however, would have wondered that anyone should think him capable of such an inconsistency. He presupposes, indeed, the cooperation of the tie in just the same way as that of the oboes. The only difference is that his marking calls for the writing of special oboe parts, whereas the tie was played from the viola part, or else, at that time, to his sorrow, he had no third oboist. If the theme requires that the solo flute should be supported in the tutti passages by the oboe or the violins, or both together. Perhaps the best example of the necessity of this rule is the aria Lass o Fürst der Cherubinnen from Herrgottig loben alle wir, number 130. It is very frequently desirable to strengthen the oboes by the flutes. The fact that both instruments played from the same part, footnote, see the acute remarks of Rust in the preface to BG's 20, end footnote. In the cantata Jesus slaft was soll ich hoffen, number 81, makes it practically certain that where Bach writes flutes, he intends the oboes also to play, and vice versa. The first and last arias sound particularly well in this arrangement. The employment of flutes in the oboe accompaniments to choruses, sometimes an octave higher, cannot be too strongly recommended. This is often the only means of ensuring that the oboe shall be really heard. It has already been said in connection with the Passions that the flutes themselves must sometimes be reinforced by the piccolo if their runs are to come out clearly. We ought not to shrink from any combination of instruments that will bring out the obbligato parts properly. These combinations are all to be found in Bach's scores. In the opening chorus of Herr gehe nicht ins Gericht, number 105, he even adds the horn to the first oboe in order to make the latter part stand out better. Perhaps it is even justifiable to try the experiment of allotting the violin soli in certain movements to 2 or more desks in the tutti. Bach's reason for marking a movement, solo violin, was frequently simply this, that the part was much too difficult for his ordinary players. As our orchestras contain many violinists with a technique sufficient for the solo, Bach himself, in these circumstances, would probably be the first to give the part to a number of the players in the tutti passages when the themes are of a powerful nature. This experiment should be tried sometimes with the Laudamus Te of the B minor Mass. The question as to whether the foregoing proposals can be adopted must be decided anew for each individual case. There are tutti in which any reinforcement of the solo instrument would be a flagrant error, many parts being conceived so absolutely in terms of the flute or the oboe that the whole effect would be ruined by the addition of any other instrument. It will seldom do harm, however, to double the instruments. The indispensable prerequisite, however, is the recognition of the fundamental fact that a conductor must interpret a Bach score discreetly and moderately. No one who knows how Bach's works have come down to us will raise much objection to the principle. Bach wrote obbligato parts, not parts for particular instruments. The subjectivity of the instrument only slightly influences his writing. He does not orchestrate in the modern way, but just as he registers on the organ. What he has in view is the particular timbre. No violence is done to his intention, however, when this timbre is simply made more effective by means of the occasional cooperation of other instruments. We must remember that many scores have come down to us without any indication as to the orchestration. If in these cases the parts are lost, the realization of the score is sometimes puzzling, even to a Bach expert. Nor must we think that when Bach repeated a cantata, he did not sometimes substitute one solo instrument for another. Frequently, circumstances would compel him to do so. What else could he do when he had, say, no good flute player, and the cantata he was repeating had a difficult solo for that instrument? In his memorial of 1730 he says that, at times, he had neither a third trumpet, nor a third oboe, nor a flutist, nor a viola player, nor a cellist, nor a contrabassist, nor sufficient violinists, and that for the bassoon he had to call upon a member of the town band. The foregoing suggestions, therefore, do not open the door to caprice, but simply indicate that we should deal with the instrumental parts just in the way that Bach himself would have done had he had sufficient space and competent players. Many justifiable complaints as to the poor effect of Bach's music will cease when once we have got rid of the mistaken notion that the few orchestral parts that have been transmitted to us give a correct idea of the performance Bach had in his mind, and that we must keep strictly to these if we wish to be right. The nature and the extent of the freedom we can import into our interpretations are not to be settled by theories, but by repeated experiments. Whatever sounds well and is impressive and does not aim merely at external effect has always some kind of artistic justification. When once the hearer has become used to the ordinary Bach orchestra of the cantatas, it gives him undisturbed pleasure. The metallic clang that results from the continual cooperation of woodwind and strings soon becomes so agreeable to him that he cannot dispense with it. A good example of splendid orchestration is the cantata Liebster Emanuel, No. 123, the introductory chorus of which is accompanied by 2 flutes, 2 oboe d'amore, and strings. If this simple orchestra does not suffice, Bach strengthens the wind. In the first chorus of Wie schön leucht uns der Morgenstern, No. 1, he adds 2 horns to the 2 oboes, the 2 concertante violins, and the remaining strings. In the opening chorus of the cantata Es ist nicht gesundes an meinem Lieber, No. 25, a choir of 4 brass wind and 3 flutes gives out a chorale to the accompaniment of the strings and oboes. In the cantata Lob den Herrn, No. 143, he adds 3 horns to his orchestra. His festival orchestra was distinguished from the ordinary one by the addition to the strings and woodwind of 4 trumpets. The instrumentation of Preis Jerusalem, No. 119, is typical: 4 trumpets, 2 flutes, 3 oboes, and 3 strings. Bach's fondness for the wind is particularly shown in his accompaniments to the solos. For the first 2 numbers of the cantata, Rufet scheinen schaffen, No. 175, he employs 3 flutes. The instrumental part of the bass aria is played by 2 trumpets. A recitative in the cantata Sie werden euch in den Bann tun, No. 183, second composition, is accompanied by 2 oboe de caccia and 2 oboe d'amore. In the first aria of Herr Gott dich loben alle wir, No. 130, and in the aria Heiligst Dreieinigkeit from Erschallet ich Lieder, No. 172, the voice has to struggle against 3 trumpets and the kettle drum. A recitative in Preis Jerusalem, No. 119, is accompanied by kettle drum, 4 trumpets, 2 flutes, and 2 oboes. In the aria Ach, es bleist in meiner Liebe from Du sollst Gott deinen Herrn, No. 77, Bach is satisfied with 1 trumpet. His fondness for clangorous sound is shown again by the fact that in a number of motet choruses he doubles the voices with the brass. Bach proceeds upon the basis of the old town band, so that many of the instruments he uses are no longer known to us today. This raises the question of the necessity of rearranging his scores. Can we perform them as they are written, or is it better to touch them up in such a way as to get the effects and timbres he wanted by a certain amount of modern reinstrumentation? End of Chapter 35, Part 3. The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions. Chapter 35, Part 4. The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2 by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 35, Part 4. The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions, continued. The modern orchestra has developed from the old by a process of selection. From each orchestral group, strings, wood, and brass, there have fallen out a number of intermediate instruments. Only the ones that were most perfect and capable of the most varied uses have stood their ground. People gave up the idea of having the same instrument in all possible registers and qualities. This reform, which at the same time implies a certain impoverishment, came from the Italians. Bach, although he was contemporary with this reform, ignored it. He employed instruments that were already becoming obsolete in his own day. Handel wrote for what was then the modern and more simplified orchestra. The brass instruments were naturally most affected by the reform, but a number of string instruments also fell into disuse. Bach still uses the violino piccolo, a small quartiege, the three-quarter violin. He makes it play in octaves with the ordinary violin. It plays a special role in the cantata Herr Christ der Einge Gottes schön, number 96, in which it has an obbligato part in conjunction with the piccolo flute. The gamba, which Bach employs in the Passions, is a six-stringed instrument, occupying a place between the cello and the viola. The viola d'amore, which he uses in the St. John Passion, somewhat resembles the viola. It had 7 strings. Under the gut strings, touched by the bow, the 3 deepest being overlaid with metal, were 7 metal strings, which increased the resonance. These gave the instrument its peculiarly beautiful timbre. The larger string instruments gave Bach a lot of trouble. Our contrabass, as yet, did not exist. The violoni and the violoni grosso, which he sometimes used in large choruses, were so imperfect that it was impossible to play his bass runs on them. Footnote. Bach's violoni could not play such basses. End footnote. The player was content to perform the principal notes, leaving the remainder to the celli and the other string instruments that cooperated an octave higher. The viola pomposa. Footnote. This instrument is never indicated in the scores. End footnote. Invented by Bach, and the violoncello piccolo. In the cantatas of Bach's later period, he often gives solo passages to the latter instrument. Footnote. It sounded an octave deeper than it was written. End footnote. What is the bearing of these facts on modern performances? The viola pomposa and the violoncello piccolo can easily be dispensed with. Bach employed them to bring out the bass more clearly. This can be done in other ways. It is partly secured, indeed, by the perfection to which the contrabass has now been brought. The violoncello piccolo solos can be played by any good cellist on his own instrument. When necessary, they can be divided between the cello and the viola. The loss of the viola d'amore is felt as a misfortune only in St. John Passion. It would be an advantage, however, if gamba playing were cultivated again, the cello and the viola, or the two together, being poor substitutes for the solos on this instrument. It will be noted that we are already beginning to realize the poverty of our string instruments and trying to remedy it. Viola players, who can also play the gamba, will probably be the rule in the future. The necessities of our modern orchestra will also compel us to look for string instruments with a higher range than the violin. Then we shall be able to perform the violin parts in many of Bach's scores in the way that makes them most effective, though he has not marked them so, that is, by doubling them with the octave above. In general, the arrangement that is equivalent to drawing a corresponding 4-feet register is quite in Bach's spirit. He himself doubles the cello in the octave with the violoncello piccolo and the violin with the violino piccolo. Bach uses both the transverse flute and the flûte da bec. In his employment of the latter, he probably stood alone among the musicians of his time. He even uses it in his later works. For example, the cantata Herr Jesus Christ war Mensch und Gott, number 127, which dates from the end of the 30s. The disappearance of the flûte à bec is not a very great misfortune. It is one of the family of long flutes. It was constructed like the open flute pipe of the organ and blown in precisely the same way. A number of finger holes, 6 to 8, made it possible to produce various tones from this primitive instrument. Some of them were always rather impure, being obtained by only half closing the hole. The overtones being completely lacking, the timbre was soft but inexpressive. Footnote: there were various kinds of flûtes à bec, including heavy bass instruments. End footnote. The parts for flûte à bec hardly suffer at all from being played on the modern transverse flute. With regard to the general question of Bach's flute parts, it may be asked whether the metal flute is not preferable in many cases to the wooden flute. The metal flute, which the French mostly use, has the advantage of speaking more easily. In many solos it is certainly more effective than the wooden flute, which is almost exclusively used in Germany. In the choruses, however, the full round tone of the wooden flute is greatly to be preferred. It is thus best to employ them together. The question of the oboe in Bach performances is not nearly so complicated now as it was a little while ago. Formerly, the oboe d'acacia and the oboe d'amore had both to be replaced by the cor anglais, which does extremely well for the oboe d'acacia, but is a poor makeshift for the oboe d'amore, the tone of the instrument Bach had in view being much softer and more tender. Footnote: the oboe d'amore is practically an alto oboe. End footnote. In the meantime, the oboe d'amore has come into use again in the modern orchestra. 5 instruments of this type are now made, which any reasonable good oboe player can master without much difficulty. The many beautiful passages for the oboe d'amore in Bach's works are only truly expressive when played as he intended them. Even the ordinary hearer at once perceives the difference. The question of the brass instruments is a very complicated one. Bach employs the trombone, the cornetto, the trumpet, and the horn. In his epoch there was a complete family of trombones: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Footnote: the trombone slide is first mentioned by Zarlino in 1588. End footnote. These instruments were capable of much purer tone than the trumpets, but could only be used in long-drawn passages. The town musicians employed them in choruses. Similarly, Bach does not use them in the orchestra, but only to accompany motet-like choruses. Each vocal part has its corresponding trombone. See, for example, the opening chorus of Ach Gott vom Himmel schied der ein, number 2. Bach frequently substitutes the cornetto for the descant trombone, in this again following the practice of the town bands. The cornetto was an instrument with a bell-shaped mouthpiece and usually an S-shaped tube of wood wrapped round with leather. The serpent was a member of this family. It was simply the bass cornetto. Footnote: the lightus, used in the cantata O Jesu Christ mein Lebenslicht, number 118, probably also belonged to the cornetto family. End footnote. The discount cornetto had 7 holes, so that, as with the flûte à bec, the player had to get the full scale by only partially closing some of the holes. Under these circumstances, several of the tones were bound to be impure. The cornetto had a clear and not very strong tone, a mixture of the timbres of the trumpet and the woodwind. Bach certainly used it to support the cantus firmus in the large chorale choruses in many places where it is not indicated either in the score or the parts. For the wind players, of course, knew the chorale melody by heart. In the motet choruses accompanied by the wind, it is best to employ the bugle for the soprano and alto trombones. The parts for the tenor and bass trombones can be played on the original instruments, the slide trombones being preferable to the valve trombones. Footnote. In England, the slide trumpet that is still in use there can probably be employed. End footnote. It should be observed that the trombones of that day, being smaller, were not so strong as ours, but had a brighter tone, as our choirs are much heavier than those of Bach's day. However, the proportions are preserved. If it is impossible to employ the brass, these motet choruses may be supported simply by the woodwind and strings, the former in as large numbers as possible. In any case, the effect will be satisfactory. Footnote. In this case, the experiment may be tried of adding the reeds of the organ. End footnote. If the upper part is a chorale, the trumpet may always take this. There can hardly be any doubt that all the chorale melodies used in the choruses, with the exception of the final chorales, should be reinforced by the trumpet, even where the score has no indication to this effect. There used to be the most confused opinions current upon the trumpet and upon the technique that Bach demanded of its players. This confusion was ended by the thorough researches of Eichborn. One error in particular needs to be cleared away. That things were possible on the old natural trumpet that are impossible on the present valve trumpet. The runs that Bach writes for his players were about as difficult on their instruments as they are on ours. The only difference is that his players were well practiced in them, while ours are not. The natural trumpet, the only one known in those days, consisted of a cylindrical tube with a thin conical opening at the top. It was generally bent and curved something like the cavalry trumpet of today. The C and D trumpets were the most frequently used. The open tube of a trumpet of this kind gave the ground tone, the octave, the fifth, the pure fourth, the major third, the minor third, the minor seventh, the major second, then a diatonic scale not quite pure in the fourth octave, and a chromatic scale in the fifth octave from the ground tone. These notes have been retained in the trumpet and can be produced theoretically by varying degrees of force in the breath pressure and the varying movements of the lips, which here correspond to the reed mouthpiece of the oboe. As the two lower octaves are poor, use was made only of some tones in the middle and the penultimate diatonic octave. The diatonic octave could be still further enriched, as on the C trumpet, F could be blown F sharp, G, G sharp, and B flat, B natural. The practicable tones were therefore the four notes of the third octave, reckoned from the ground tone, the diatonic scale of the fourth octave with F sharp, G sharp, and B. Footnote. The diatonic octave could have been further enriched by stopping, a device derived from the technique of the horn. In Bach's time, however, this was not thought of. End of footnote. Of the fifth chromatic octave, the first four diatonic tones were the most important, since the other intervals, though theoretically complete, could not be obtained owing to the difficulty of getting the necessary fineness of lip pressure. Yet, in the second Brandenburg Concerto, Bach demands from the solo trumpet the fifth diatonic note of this octave, the G. Eichborn gives the following as the scale. The mysterious art of clarino playing. Footnote. In the 17th and early 18th centuries a distinction was made between the players of the upper and of the lower trumpet parts, the former being called clarino, the latter principale. End footnote. Therefore consisted of nothing more than the mastery of these tones by incessant practice from youth upwards. Bach's reason for writing his parts so high was that these were the only notes that were at all complete on the instruments of that epoch. The player was helped by the easy speaking of his simple and delicately constructed instrument and its narrow dimensions. Footnote. The narrower the trumpet, the easier are its high notes, and the more difficult its lower ones. The former are of fine quality, while the middle and lower register are dry. End footnote. Moreover, he employed a special mouthpiece for playing in the high register. The smoother that is, and the sharper its angle, the easier and more certain are the attack and the articulations of the high notes. According to Eichborn, the following would be the ideal shape for the mouthpiece in clarino playing. Small diagram. As a matter of fact, it does not alter the tone wholly for the better. In the higher register, it becomes dry and lacking in expression. We cannot therefore suppose the contemporary rendering of Bach's trumpet parts to have been ideal. As the above table shows, a number of tones remained impure even in the best circumstances. Others were uncertain. The timbre in the upper register was not beautiful, resembling that of a child's trumpet. The one advantage of the instrument, and it is a very great advantage with regard to Bach's orchestration, was that its tone was weaker than that of the trumpet of today. An oboe, or certainly two oboes, could hold their own against it quite well. After the practice ceased of writing scores in purely obbligato parts, that is to say, after the middle of the 18th century, there was no motive for the study of clarino playing. About the same time, the town bands also became extinct. At the end of the century, valve trumpets began to be made in England and Germany. From these there developed the modern instrument. Our trumpet really unites several instruments in one. The arrangements of crooks and valves allowing the player to lengthen or shorten the tube at will. Footnote. The three valves of the modern trumpet correspond in their combinations to 7 positions. End footnote. By combining the serviceable diatonic notes of these various trumpets, we get the complete chromatic scale. The nature of the trumpet is not altered in any way. As before, the performer plays on the natural trumpet. Only by a pressure of the finger he places to his mouth each time the trumpet produces the desired note, most easily and purely. Footnote. It should be observed, however, that the lower third cannot be produced on the valve trumpet as a natural note. End footnote. And on this adaptable instrument he can do whatever is possible on the natural trumpet. Of course, the other conditions must be fulfilled. When some musicians were discussing the possibility of playing Bach's trumpet passages and expressing every possible theory on the subject, Gevaert, the director of the Brussels Conservatoire, dryly interjected that it was une question d'embouchure et d'entraînement. That is the whole point. It is simply a question of the mouthpiece and technique. With the ordinary mouthpiece, Bach's higher notes cannot be easily and surely played. Flatter ones make them possible. It is a matter of finding the right type and of our players' lips becoming accustomed to it. It cannot be too flat if beauty of tone is desired. Footnote. After some years of research and experiment, the trumpeter of the Brussels Conservatoire has constructed a special mouthpiece for performing the Bach and Handel trumpet parts. Of course, the art of producing the high notes purely and easily is not to be learned in a day. Still less can a Bach trumpet part be played at sight at rehearsal, nor, when this proves impossible, should it be declared unplayable. If there ever comes a generation of players who practice Bach from the commencement and make a special study of the higher register and of the lip technique demanded by the flat mouthpiece, people will be astonished at the long prevalence of the view that Bach wrote unplayable trumpet parts. It must be admitted that the valve trumpet, as it is constructed today, rather increases the difficulty of blowing. The complicated path taken by the column of air as it passes through one of the crooks hinders its free vibration. The attack of the note is not so natural as in the normal trumpet, where the air path is not so circuitous. This inconvenience, however, can be greatly diminished by making the tubes as thin and delicate as possible and by avoiding all superfluous apparatus for the evacuation of moisture and all unnecessary solderings. By these means the vibratory capacity of the valve trumpet may be made not much less than that of the natural trumpet. The proper performance of Bach's trumpet parts demands therefore very lightly built and narrow valve trumpets, special mouthpieces, tested in every detail, and particularly practiced players. Footnote: it must not be forgotten that the trumpeters of Bach's day had a much more practiced ear than modern players have for the intervals that are produced solely with the lips. End footnote. We may affirm, however, that even the ordinary performances of the present day are in many respects better than those of Bach's players, the tones being purer and more certain. We can therefore put up with a certain sluggishness of tone in the higher notes. Until the ideal Bach trumpet comes, we should employ, in the cantatas, the trumpet in D, for which Bach usually writes. The trumpets in high D made by Alexander of Mainz may be recommended. They not only greatly lighten the task of the player who is accustomed to them, but produce a tone which, particularly in the higher register, is much softer than the ordinary. It has already been remarked, in discussing the Brandenburg concertos, that the firm's trumpet in high F is the best for the second concerto. But a good player should not despair if he cannot play the part easily on the new instrument after several weeks' practice. Familiarity is a matter not of weeks and months, but of years. It is more than doubtful whether Bach had trumpet parts of this kind performed by one player only. Eichborn draws attention to the number of trumpets employed in an orchestra in that epoch, and conjectures, perhaps rightly, that they shared difficult passages between them, each of them taking a short section. Whether this view be right or wrong historically, the plan recommends itself. It is barbarous to expect our trumpeters to play a Bach part from beginning to end. From artistic considerations alone, we ought to employ two, since the moment a wind player becomes ever so little fatigued, he loses his certainty in high passages. The demands made on the trumpeters in a Bach performance are so severe because the same player, if he belongs to an orchestra, has so recently had to produce the deeper tones required from the trumpet in modern compositions. We shall probably come to a time when wind players will specialize for Bach and Handel, and will be as much sought after and as well paid as the solo singers. When no good trumpeters are to be had, it is always best to give the higher trumpet part to 2 or 3 C or D clarinets, or at all events to resort to the assistance of these in the high notes. It should be mentioned that in his earlier works Bach writes for the trumpet in a more fanfare-like and less obbligato style than in his later ones. These early parts are really the finest and most effective that he ever wrote for the instrument. An example may be seen in the cantata Es erhab sich ein Streit, number 19. Whether, even with good instruments and good players, we can ever be made to enjoy the arias accompanied by 2 or 3 trumpets is another question. But till this time comes, we must not revolt at the device of substituting the woodwind for the brass, out of pity for the voice, when there is only one singer. The question of the horn is similar to that of the trumpet. It was only a little time before Bach's death that the muting of the horn was achieved by the Bohemian Anton Hambel. Bach is acquainted only with the simple corno-da-cassia, the hunting horn, that had come into use in Paris at the end of the 17th century and beginning of the 18th. Thus the hornist, like the trumpeter, had to use special mouthpieces for the high notes. In connection with Bach, it is therefore more correct to speak of a trumpet in the form of a horn than of a real horn. The timbre of the modern horn is somewhat duller than what Bach had in view. If the part is a high one, it is as well to divide it between horn and trumpet, since only the finest horn virtuosi can produce the upper tones well. The bugle, if the player is at all master of his instrument, gives better results than one is commonly inclined to suppose. It may be observed that even experienced musicians among the audience wonder at the flexibility of the runs, without suspecting that it is not the ordinary horn that is playing. Footnote. This, of course, is only a makeshift until such time as our hornists shall again be expert in the higher registers. End footnote. As the tone of the modern trumpet and horn is stronger than that of the instruments of Bach's day, we must see that we get the right relation between the brass on the one side and the strings and wood on the other. Every voice in a Bach score counts for as much as the others. But this is true not only of the orchestral parts among themselves, but of these in relation to the voice parts. The flute part must come out just as clearly as that of the soprani in the choir. The true essence of a Bach score does not consist in the accompaniment of the chorus by the orchestra, but in the cooperation of a vocal mass and an instrumental mass of equal significance with it. In the performances under Bach himself, indeed, the orchestral part was in the ascendant. In a festival cantata there were 18 or 20 instruments to 12 singers. But even on the ordinary occasions he had at least as many first and second violins as soprani and alti, if not more, as is shown by the fact that the parts for those instruments are frequently written out in duplicate, which is not often the case with the vocal parts. Nor must we forget that the slight attention of the bow in those days led to a much smaller tone being drawn from the violin than is customary today. It is in this light that we must consider our present practice of performing Bach's cantatas with choirs of 200 voices. It was mistakenly assumed to be self-evident that the orchestra should be quite weak in comparison with the choir, and should be practically inaudible when the latter ended. Those who were conscious of this disproportion felt the need for reorchestration of the works which they often carried out. The most natural solution of the problem, however, is to strengthen the instrumental parts in proportion to the numbers of the choir. There was nothing in the modern view to negate an increase in the number of the strings, but the advocates of reorchestration made merry over the proposal to employ with a large choir a dozen oboes, a dozen flutes, and half a dozen bassoons, and ridiculed the idea of asking a modern audience to listen to a bellowing of this kind. This, however, did not disconcert the advocates of performances in accordance with the original score. Siegfried Och, in particular, fought gallantly both with word and deed for the right principle. His performances have shown that it is possible to get an instrumental equivalent to a large chorus without any reorchestration, simply by using the proper number of instruments, and that an orchestra of this kind, if efficiently handled, is not in the slightest degree unwieldy. The old notion that Bach's music cannot be performed just as it is written will probably die out by degrees. We still, however, occasionally meet with a choral conductor who, when a beautiful cantata is recommended to him, immediately asks whether there is an arrangement of it published, which shows how our self-reliance has been destroyed by these arranged editions. As the tone of our instruments is much stronger than that of the older ones, and some of the numbers of our mixed choirs do not count at full strength, something like the following disposition of the orchestra may be recommended for a choir of 50 to 80 voices: 6 first violins, 6 seconds, 6 violas, 4 cellos, 2 contrabasses, 2 flutes, and 2 oboes for each part. For a choir of 100 to 150 voices, the following would be the ideal: 10 first violins, 10 seconds, 10 violas, 6 cellos, 4 contrabasses, 6 flutes, and 6 oboes for each part. Even at the end of the 18th century, it was taken for granted that the orchestra was to be hardly numerically weaker than the choir. Hiller had an enormous orchestra at the famous performance of The Messiah at Berlin in 1788. After the size, the disposition of the orchestra is of prime importance. The customary arrangement with the orchestra thrust like a wedge into the choir is perhaps not the best for a Bach performance. The strings and woodwind are better placed in front of the choir, Only in this way can the proper effect be secured. Footnote: to increase the effect of the woodwind, they should be placed in the forefront before the violins. End footnote. It is a mistake for the conductor to make the orchestra play piano at the entry of the chorus, which he sometimes does in accordance with modern custom, or because the instruments sound too loud where he is standing. It is very seldom that a listener in the church or the concert room finds the orchestra too loud in a Bach chorus. It much more frequently happens that he simply does not hear it at all. It cannot be too often repeated that in a Bach performance it is not a question of an accompanying orchestra, but of the cooperation of a vocal choir and an instrumental choir, the latter playing, if anything, the leading role. End of chapter 35, part 4. The performance of the Cantatas and Passions continued. Chapter 35, part 5. The performance of the Cantatas and Passions continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2, by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 35, Part 5. The performance of the Cantatas and Passions continued. The correct proportions of the instrumental forces, however, are not enough. The correct realization of the figured bass is also essential. Bach's obbligato parts, absolutely free as they are in their movements, presuppose a harmonic foundation. The harmonies resulting from the combination of these parts necessarily contain retardations, dissonances, and consonances that arise from the casual meeting of the themes rather than from the harmonic ground plan of the whole. If the hearer perceives only the obbligato parts, he will get, even when the writing is in 4 or 5 parts, only a confused and incomplete sense of the harmony that Bach had in his mind. The essential is mixed up with the accidental. It is in the figured bass that Bach has indicated the real decisive harmonic sequences. This figured bass is not an abstract of the harmonies made by the obbligato parts, but occupies a quite independent position with regard to these, sometimes so independent that at the first glance one might doubt the correctness of the figuring, which does not seem to agree with the orchestral parts. In a Bach work, therefore, we have to take account of a kind of final harmony resulting from the combined activities of the fundamental harmony of the figured bass and the moving harmonies of the obbligato parts. It is only the presupposition that the firm ground harmony defining the course of the piece will be brought out elsewhere that Bach can venture to let the voices go their own way unhindered, without anxiety as to the general harmonic stability of this or that bar. It is with his music as with the façade of the Strasbourg Cathedral. The rich filigree ornamentation that covers this like a veil of fine lace carved in stone would not have the needful firmness and consistency unless it were supported by a whole network of delicate iron bars. Bach's obbligato parts are held together in the same way by the fundamental harmonies of the figured bass. The first thing he did after finishing a cantata was to prepare the figured continuo part. When Bach's works began to be revived, no account was taken of the figured bass, even in cases where only the bass and a solo instrument were playing together, which seems almost incomprehensible when we reflect that at that time Zelter and other musicians with a knowledge of the traditions of the old school were still living. In the first pianoforte edition of the St. Matthew Passion, 1830, not a note of the figured bass is given even in the arias. The performances were of the same character. The public was treated to a dialogue between a contrabass and a flute, or even to a contrabass monologue, and it was all put down to the account of the good old times. If the conductor found it unendurable, he cut these passages out of the arias or did away with the aria altogether. It was only after the issue of the great Bach-Gesellschaft edition that the musicians who were interested in Bach learned of the existence of the figured bass. It was an unexpected revelation for them. Their feeling of salvation is described for us in Robert Franz's open letter to Hanslick. 447. The new impulse was so strong, however, that it overshot its mark. The figured bass began to be regarded merely as a license for all kinds of experiments, the object of which was to eliminate every trace of Zopf and to obtain an orchestral tone that should be as rich and varied as possible. Thus, Robert Franz became the father of the arrangement theory. His piano editions and practical editions, and those that followed his lead, became the standard among lovers of Bach, and to some extent still remain the standard. The hearer now got a modern substitute for the figured harmonies, instead of the harmonies in their original form and on the original instrument. This discussion, which is not yet settled, has therefore two questions to decide. The first is, shall the figured harmonies be given to the instrument for which Bach intended them, or to the orchestra? The second, which is bound up with the first, is whether we ought to realize the harmonic sequences in accordance with Bach's own indications, or whether we should be coming closer to his ideas by setting our imaginations to work upon the harmonies. As both Rust and Spitter have remarked, the only original instrument to be considered in connection with the realization of the through bass is the organ, on both historical and practical grounds. Footnote. For the benefit of the lay reader, it may be pointed out that through bass part and continuo part are identical terms, signifying the copy of the instrumental bass part in which Bach has indicated the harmonies by means of figures. End footnote. There is no evidence that Bach used the cembalo for the vocal solos. Footnote. See Voigt's strictures on Seifert's hypothesis. There are some other valuable reflections in Richard Buchmeyer's article Cembalo oder Pianoforte in the Bach book for 1908. End footnote. We must remember that while in every cantata of which we possess the parts there is a figured continuo part, generally in Bach's own handwriting, transposed a tone lower for the organ. It is only rarely that we have a thorough bass part that is untransposed and therefore suitable for the cembalo. Footnote to organ. At that epoch the pitch of the instruments differed from that of the organ. Moreover, the pitch in which vocal and instrumental works was performed was at that time about a semitone lower than ours. Footnote for cembalo. There was certainly a cembalo in the organ gallery. We still possess the description and the accounts of the installation and tuning of it. End footnote. It is a question, therefore, of either organ or orchestra. And here it must certainly be admitted that there is a very strong temptation to entrust the working out of the harmonic foundation to the orchestra. From this, it seemed to go without saying that Bach's figuring really only served the player as a harmonic starting point for an original accompaniment conceived in the general spirit of the work. Footnote. This is the opinion expressed by Robert Franz in his open letter to Hanslick. It was on this principle that he and his successors made their pianoforte arrangements, and up to quite recently, organists who had to accompany in Bach's works accepted this theory almost as a dogma. End footnote. Rochlit's remark is correct as far as it goes, only he forgets to add that it refers to what Bach used to do with the meagre and imperfect figurings of others, not to his practice with regard to his own thorough bass, which, with its rich and uninterrupted figuring, of itself supplies the fantasy he desired in the accompaniment of his works. No comparison is possible between Bach's figured basses and those of Handel. The latter merely give simple and often rather uninteresting chordal sequences. The former represent a strict 4- or 5-part movement, in which each voice is an obbligato part. Bach did not permit his pupils to interpret the basses as they liked. The precise rules for realizing the figuring have been transmitted to us. We have figured basses of Bach's that have been worked out by Kernberger, presumably in the spirit of his master. Footnote. The following are the main documents on the question of the realization of the figured basses. 1. The rules given in Anna Magdalena's Clavier bookline. 2. Peter Kellner's copy of precepts dictated to him by Bach. 3. The Albinoni violin sonata. 4. Kernberger's realization of the thorough bass in the trio from the Musikalisches Opfer. End footnote. Anyone who really tries to construct the figured bass part according to these principles will soon see that they generate a finer fantasy than any we can invent for ourselves. This holds good also of the movements that are accompanied by the continuo alone. If Bach in these places gives only the bass figure to the instruments and the upper voices to the organ, it is not because he is too indolent to write something for the other instruments, but because the bass figure is so important and so independent that the hearer's attention must not be distracted from it by any other instrumental parts. Observe, however, what simple and beautiful melodic upper parts can be obtained by the proper realization of the figuring. The pity is that these movements are so disfigured in our piano editions. Footnote. What violence can be done to the intentions of the composer may be seen in the fanciful realization of the figured bass of the aria Gewaltig stoßt Gott from Meine Schiel erhabt den Herrn, No. 10, in Breitkopf and Hartel's piano edition. End footnote. The realization of the continuo part in the choruses is affected by the fact that our forces are different from those of Bach's day. Orchestra and choir are much larger than they were then. If we realize the thorough bass on the same scale, it sounds too loud, while if we tone it down too much, it does not fulfill its purpose. Long experiment is necessary before we hit upon the proportions in which choir and orchestra will blend properly. Of course, the problem of the modern organist, owing to the situation created by our huge forces, is different from that of the organist who accompanied under Bach himself. He has to help the parts to stand out and to make choral effects tell. A very great deal depends upon his cooperation. He has this advantage over Bach's organist, that he can study his part in advance from the score. The conductor and he should come to a complete understanding before the first rehearsal as to the role the continuo accompaniment is to play in the choruses of the work. The organ must always play where there is a figured bass, therefore also in the chorales and the recitatives that are accompanied by the orchestra. Even when the organ harmonies are so discreetly filled in that the hearer does not perceive them independently and cannot be certain of the organist's cooperation, they still ought to be there, since they form the substratum that supports the instrumental harmonies, giving these not only composure and steadiness, but also a peculiarly soft colouring. Unfortunately, the voicing of our organs is an obstacle to proper accompaniment. The excessive wind pressure produces too dull a tone, and one that blends neither with the voices nor with the instruments. Footnote. The general unsuitability of our modern organ tone for Bach's music has been discussed in Chapter 14. End footnote. The organ timbre should be the soft harmonic ground against which the lines of the obbligato parts can group themselves. Instead of this, it rather serves to confuse these lines and efface them. As soon as we happen to accompany a passion or a cantata on a good Silbermann organ, we realize for the first time how unsuitable the modern organ is for that purpose. On our instruments, we have to experiment for a long time until we have found a number of registers which, when properly blended, give the desired quality of tone. Organ accompaniment, as we so often hear it, is simply calculated to disfigure Bach's music, and we cannot blame the advocates of the arrangement theory if they substitute the orchestra for the heavy and often heavily handled instrument and merely call upon the organ for assistance here and there. In the accompaniment of the soli, we have to take into account this drawback, that the swell chest manual which we use for this purpose is placed high up and at the back, and so is a long way off the platform with the soloists and orchestra, which renders impossible not only an exact ensemble, but any kind of blending of tone. In a big performance, therefore, there should be substituted for the large organ, in the recitatives and arias, a small portable positive placed among the instruments. It must be remembered that the positive of the main organ, on which Bach had the soloists accompanied, came out into the church. The proposal to substitute the harmonium for the old portable positive is incomprehensible. Bach wants the wide tone of the Musikgedacht and the solitional of his day, and for this we would substitute the narrow nasal tone of the harmonium, replace an instrument with proper flue pipes by one in which the vibrations are produced by metal tongues? Footnote. Even connoisseurs of the old instruments, such as Gevaert and Seifert, have unfortunately become the advocates of the harmonium. End footnote. The tone of the portative organ we meet with today is, indeed, not calculated to prove the possibility of using this instrument, though it alone has historical justification. One would think that the sole purpose of the builders had been to show what a coarse tone can be produced even on a miniature organ. If they would only make again portative organs voiced in the Silbermann style, people would be astounded at the ideal support this delicate tone gives to the singer and the instruments, and how perfectly it carries. In case of need, a one manual portative with bourdon 8-foot and solicional 8-foot will suffice. The ideal would be a two manual instrument with bourdon 8-foot, solicional 8-foot, and flute 4-foot on the second manual, and bourdon 16-foot and principal 8-foot on the first. It should be observed that a portative organ is not relatively any dearer than a harmonium. Footnote. Of course, the present-day portative should be fitted with a Venetian shutter swell so as to make crescendi and diminuendi possible. A pedal is also desirable. End footnote. Almost more important than the question of the harmonies is that of bringing out the bass. With Bach, the bass is not, as with other composers, merely a harmonic foundation line. It is at the same time an obbligato part, of the detail of which the hearer must be just as conscious as of those of any other part. In the church or the concert room, the bass is usually not heard at all, or only in fragments, and for this the conductors and organists are answerable, who give far too little attention to this question. The large size of our orchestras and choirs increases the difficulty of bringing out the bass. How is it possible to produce in the lower part a real equivalent to such salient upper parts? Not by any increase in the number of the contrabasses. Too many of them, or too forcible playing, is rather a disadvantage, as it gives a peculiar buzz to the tone. It is much better to add to the number of the cellos and to reinforce them with bassoons. Sometimes, also, a few violas will be very effective, playing the bass part an octave higher, instead of the violoncello piccolo. But all this does not suffice with a large chorus and orchestra. The tone lacks the necessary consistency. The arrangers of Bach's vocal works have been acutely conscious of this problem, and have tried to solve it with the deep brass instruments. This, however, is practicable only in the rare cases where Bach has written tranquil basses, and even there the brass is much too heavy. The only solution is the employment of flue work stops in the lower register, and for this only the organ is of use. Only when strings and flue work stops play the bass figures together can the latter, without becoming obtrusive, hold their own against the vocal and orchestral upper parts, having now a tone colour adequate to the whole mass. The proper rendering of the organ part therefore consists in letting the left hand play the bass part note for note, and with the right phrasing, on a stronger manual, while the right takes the figuring on a softer manual. This is the tradition. It is also the course suggested by practical experiment. The pedal is not in itself requisite in accompanying. Naturally, however, a good player will make use of it and find many opportunities to turn his dexterity to account. For example, if he wishes to bring out with appropriate force the lower voices in a chorus, he will employ 3 basses, one for the passages with orchestra alone, a somewhat stronger one for the ordinary combination of chorus and orchestra, and a strong one for the forte passages. He will draw a bass on the chief manual and one on the pedal, and let the 3 basses separate or combine using either the manual or the pedal, or both together, it making no difference in the latter case whether he copies or plays the same part with the left hand and the feet. This shading in the bass was not desired by the accompanist in Bach's day. It is rendered necessary, however, by the size of our modern forces, and of course the player will employ the pedal also in cases where, as in the choral cantatas, he has to reproduce a cantus firmus, or where he strikes the chords on the great organ in order to bring out special effects, or where he plays the harmonies on 2 different manuals so as to bring a part out more clearly. He must never forget, however, that he is solely responsible for the proper effect of the bass figure. The treble it gives and the combinations it demands are well known to every organist who has had to perform this task in the chorale chorus O Mensch, wie Wein dein Schunde groß in the St. Matthew Passion. Care should be taken that the registration is not too dull. Bach's bass figures are conceived in 8-feet tone, and therefore too many contrabass and 16-feet stops are bad, as they make the part sound an octave too low and leave a gap between it and the next highest part, that of the violas. 8-feet stops should therefore be used throughout, even in the pedal. 1 or 2 16-feet stops will be enough. Frequently, none at all are necessary in the manual on which the left hand is playing. Footnote: in the first chorus of Ein feste Burg, number 80, for example, the bass should be played with 8-feet stops alone, and the 16 feet only employed when the cantus firmus enters in the lower part. In the opening chorus of the cantata Du sollst Gott deinen Herrn, number 77, it is clear from the clefs Bach has used that with the exception of the cantus firmus, the whole bass is to be played with 8-feet stops. It goes without saying that when the cantus firmus enters in the bass, it must be reinforced by a trombone. Bach assuredly posted a trombone player by the organ to join in these passages. End footnote. On the other hand, it must not be forgotten that Bach, as is shown by his instrumentation, counts on the 4-feet tone also for the bass figure. In forte bass parts, 2 or 3 fine and clear 4-feet stops are extremely effective. Nor should we shrink from the use of mixtures and reeds if they happen to be good. In general, we should aim at a clear and intense rather than a thick tone color, if only for the sake of precision. For the arias also, we must have in readiness 2 bass timbres, one for the tutti, the other for the accompaniment passages. It depends upon circumstances whether we shall draw a soft bourdon 16-foot or not. We must remember that if the bass contains many sustained notes, as in the recitatives for example, the 16-feet tone easily becomes obtrusive, and an unpleasant hollow is left between the bass and the harmonic parts. A good 8-feet bourdon in the deep octave will often be better. In any case, the organ bass should never cease, even in the solo movements. As soon as it does so, even if we have not been conscious of hearing it before, the cellos and contrabasses also disappear, since their foundation is now lacking. The movements in which only the bass and the organ accompany may generally sound so badly because the 4-feet tone, which gives the necessary clearness and distinctness, is missing from the bass. It may be remarked that, according to some parts that have come down to us, and sundry indications in the scores, Bach had the contrabasses and cellos supported in these passages by the violas, or the violas and violins, at any rate in the tutti. We shall probably not go wrong if we observe this rule in many solos that are accompanied by the continuo alone. Footnote. In the aria Hasche nur from Die Himmel erzählen, number 76, the gambas play with the bass. In the aria Streiter Sieger starke Held from Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, second composition, number 62, Bach writes, Violini e viole sempre col continuo. The importance of this marking consists in the fact that it is only inserted because of the sempre. It was self-evident that the violins and violas in these passages should play from the continuo part, but not that they were to continue sempre, that is, in the piano passages as well, where the voice entered. It therefore had to be marked so. End footnote. In performances under Bach himself, the violin seem very often to have seized upon the entry of the solo voice, and to have only joined again in the tutti. Footnote. Authentic information as to this may be had, for example, in the alto aria in Was Gott tut, das ist wohl geten, number 100. Bach's principles on this point may be studied most fully in the secular cantata O Holder Tag, BG 29, which is richly provided with con violone and senza violone marks. End footnote. This, however, is no reason why we, if we have one or two good contrabasses at our disposal, should not let them join in piano. For a long time it was thought pedantic to use contrabass and cello for accompanying the recitatives. Many who tried to dispense with these instruments, for example, in the part of the evangelist, ultimately had to revert to the old practice, since the organ bass alone is not sufficiently clear and precise, even for simple chord progressions. It does not allow of accents in the basses. In the fine quaver figures of the bass of arioso movements, an excellent effect is obtained by strengthening the cellos, and a discreetly used bassoon often does good service. The gaps that are created when the proper continuo accompaniment ceases may be realized in such a cantata very fully orchestrated throughout, as Ich will den Kreuzstab gern tragen, number 56, which is often performed in the concert room with a harmonium. In the St. Matthew Passion we see from the score that in the recitatives of Jesus the strings enter with the organ and continue with it. If we go contrary to Bach's intentions here, we must take into account the restless and peculiarly flickering quality of the chords that are sustained by the strings alone. The softest bourdon or salicionelle, so soft as not to be audible in the ensemble, gives them a quite new character, much quieter and more uniform, without the accompaniment being at all strengthened by the device. Footnote. A very interesting example of the joint performance of chords by orchestra and organ may be had in the recitative Wer doppelt euch demnach from Christen Atzet diesen Tag, number 63. The organ binds them together in crotchets, the orchestra separates them by means of quavers with rests between. End footnote. The accompanying organist usually lays far too little store by precision. We still hear the organ after chorus and orchestra have ceased. In the arias and recitatives it is always a shade too late. The player, however, thinks he is perfectly in time. He has forgotten that the lower register, in which he duplicates the bass, necessarily speaks somewhat more slowly, and that a certain delay is caused by the distance between the first orchestral desks and the organ, which is often considerable owing to the size of our choirs, to say nothing of the fact that very many organists follow not the conductor, but their own ear, which doubles and trebles the chances of error. Precision in accompaniment is possible only when the conductor's beat is scrupulously obeyed, and care is taken always to be the merest trifle ahead in pressing down and releasing the keys. The organist must always feel that he is entering or ceasing a shade too soon. If it sounds quite right to him, he may be sure that in the hall or the church the organ sounds too late. As the full effect of Bach's music depends upon the proper bringing out of the harmonic basis of the obbligato parts, and of these again among themselves, conductors and organists should try to discover at rehearsal how things sound from various parts of the hall. Otherwise, as it is impossible for them to judge of the relative strength of the various parts from where they sit, they will frequently err as to the real effect of this or that passage. To discover whether his registration is right, the organist should temporarily give up his seat at rehearsal to a pupil. He will then have some valuable experiences and will realize how the smallest detail is often of the utmost importance. It may happen that the proper timbre depends upon the drawing or closing of a soft 4-feet register, the presence or absence of which seems of no consequence whatever. For a good player, perhaps the best organ part is a piano score, in which he has entered the thorough bass figuring and the main lines upon which he will work it out. He must not forget, however, to revise the basses, or else he will unconsciously play a number of false notes in every cantata. With experience he will learn to get his effect, not by motless successions of tone combinations, but by fine transitions between various degrees of strength and tonal nuances. In the recitatives, much harm is done by the chords being too massive and too loud in comparison with the voice. Organ accompaniment is a matter of temperament. An impetuous, unreflecting temperament, however, often does the wrong thing. The right thing comes only from a temperament that is thoughtful and refined. End of Chapter 35, Part 5. The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions. Chapter 35, Part 6. The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions, continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2 by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 35, Part 6. The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions, continued. The following are some of the cantatas most frequently performed. Gottes Zeit, number 106. Ich hatte viel Bekommernis, number 21. Ein feste Burg, number 80. Wachet auf, number 140. Ich will den Kreuzstab gerne tragen, number 56. Gott der Herr ist Sonn und Schild, number 79. Ach wie flüchtig, ach wie nichtig, number 26. Halt im Gedächtnis, number 67. Other works equally fine are seldom or never given. Breitkopf and Hartel have not yet engraved the parts of many wonderful cantatas, having never yet been asked for them. The explanation of this unequal appreciation of Bach's works is that very few conductors possess the complete edition, and so are in a position to make a free choice. The others keep to the cantatas of which arrangements are published, or which they have heard or seen in some program or other. Footnote. See Voigt's remarks in the Bach-Jahr book for 1906. End footnote. It sometimes happens, too, that choir conductors make a bad choice through ignorance, selecting a too difficult cantata for a not very expert choir simply because they do not know the easy ones, or they give a public imperfectly acquainted with Bach a cantata that is not calculated to make it understand and love him more, but rather to frighten it. It goes without saying, too, that in choosing a cantata the quality of the text should be taken into consideration. The following lists, without pretending to be complete, may be of assistance in making a proper selection. They include only works that are effective as a whole and of which the texts are satisfactory. Cantatas particularly suitable for performance: Komm du Schuss Todesstunde, number 161, Himmelskonings sei willkommen, number 182, Wachet betet, number 70, Wünscht es Freudenlicht, number 184, Herr, geh nicht ins Gericht, number 105, Schauet doch und sehet, number 46, Liebster Gott, wann wer ich sterben, number 8, Es erhob sich ein Streit, number 19, Christus, der ist mein Leben, number 95, Herr, deine Augen, number 102, Es ist nicht Gesundes an meinem Lieb, number 25, Gott fahret auf mit Jausten, number 43, Am Abend aber desselbigen Sabbats, number 42. Some of the recitatives should be cut, and the middle section of the first aria should be provided with new words. Nun ist das Heil und die Kraft, number 50. Es wartet alles auf dich, number 187. The text is very fine. Jesu nun sei gepreiset, number 41. Very large choir. Gelobet seist du, JoyChris, number 91. Meinen Jesum lass ich nicht, number 124. Meine Ziel erhebt den Herrn, number 10. Mach dich mein Geist bereit, number 115. Ach, lieben Christen, seid getrost, number 114. Du Freudefürst, Herr JoyChris, number 116. The following are easy to perform and are of a more popular character. Aus der Tiefe, number 131. Uns ist ein Kind geboren, number 142. Nun kommt der Heiden Heiland, number 61, first composition. Seht welch eine Lieb, number 64. Es ist das Heil uns kommen her, number 9. Wer da glaubt und getauft wird, number 37. Das neugeborene Kindlein, number 122. Aus Tiefer Not, number 38, omitting the aria Ich höre, which is borrowed from another work. Ach Herr, mich armen Sünder, number 135, without the tenor aria, which is probably borrowed. The following cantatas are useful for winning over a public that is musically cultured but not yet intimate with Bach. Die Himmel ersahlen, number 76. Sie werden aus Saba aller kommen, number 65. Du wahrer Gott und David schon, number 23. Herr, wie du wilt, number 73. Du Härter Israel, number 104. Ihr werdet weinen und heulen, number 103. Ich hellender Mensch, number 48. Liebster Emmanuel, number 123. Was mein Gott will, number 111. Of the solo cantatas, the following may be mentioned. Mein Gott wie lang ach lang, number 155, alto, tenor, bass. Meine Ziel rühmt und preist, number 189, tenor. Schau lieber Gott wie meiner Feind, number 153, alto, tenor, bass. Very popular. Mein liebster Jesus ist verloren, number 154, alto, tenor, bass. Freut seid im neuen Bunde, number 83, alto, tenor, bass. The text is very fine. Wahrlich, ich sage euch, number 86, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Easily understood, text very fine. Wo gehst du hin? Number 166, alto, tenor, bass. Easily understood, text very fine. Ich lasse dich nicht, du segnest mich denn. Number 157, tenor, bass. Sehet wird gern hinaus nach Jerusalem. Number 159, alto, tenor, bass. Ich habe genug, number 82, bass. Schlage doch gewünschte Stunde, number 53, alto. Ich armer Mensch, ich Sünde Knecht, Number 55, tenor. Was soll ich aus dir Mädchen, Ephraim? Number 89, soprano, alto, bass. Siehe, ich will viel Fischer. Number 88, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Ich bin ein guter Herd. Number 85, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Bisher hast ihr nichts gebellen in meinem Namen. Number 87, alto, tenor, bass. Selig ist der Mann. Number 57, soprano, bass. Süßer Trost mein Jesu kommt. Number 151, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Liebste Jesu mein Verlangen. Number 32, soprano, bass. Meine Seufzer, meine Tränen. Number 13, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Es reifet euch ein schrecklich Ende. Number 90, alto, tenor, bass. Meine Ziel rühmt und preist. Number 189, tenor, short and simple. Der Friede sei mit euch. Number 158, bass, very simple. The accompaniment consists only of continuo and a solo violin. O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort. Number 60, second composition, alto, tenor, bass. Ach Gott, wie manches Herzleid. Number 58, second composition, soprano, bass. It is hoped that these lists may be of assistance not only to choir conductors but to musical amateurs who can sing, and that they may help to introduce the cantatas into the home. In Mendelssohn's time these works were given in small circles, often with a modest choir, with a pianoforte accompaniment. In this way many came to learn their Bach. This practice has unfortunately ceased just at the time when Bach's cantatas can be had so easily and so cheaply. We seldom find amateurs in possession of any but those that have been performed in their neighborhood. Our amateur singers wait for collections of Bach's arias, instead of getting a number of cantatas containing the finest arias for their peculiar kind of voice. Footnote. In this respect, the solo cantatas mentioned above should first be taken into account. Of the others may be mentioned numbers 25, 31, 52, 68, 72, 94, 115, 127, 133, 146, 149 as containing particularly fine soprano numbers. Numbers 20, 108, 114, 115, 125, 148, 161, 187 for particularly fine alto numbers. Numbers 1, 19, 22, 48, 65, 75, 85, 91, 95, 96, 114, 123, 124, 161, 172, 180 for particularly fine tenor numbers, and numbers 27, 46, 66, 69, 73, 75, 104, 145 for particularly fine bass numbers. Splendid duets for alto and tenor will be found in numbers 63, 80, and 111. For alto and bass in number 106. For soprano and bass in numbers 140, 152. For soprano and alto in numbers 172, 184, and 186. End of footnote. Even many professional singers have only a limited knowledge of the works that concern them. If it should come about that the cantatas are performed publicly, but at the same time fall into disuse in domestic circles, in which the first enthusiasm for Bach sprang up about a century ago, we should have won only half the victory. Perhaps the finest feature of Bach's destiny is that, without his ever having dreamt of it, he has provided the world with a spiritual domestic music. The performances of the cantatas by a few singers with pianoforte accompaniment may be imperfect, but if the performers only have their heart in their work, they are fully conscious of the beauty of the music and their souls feel the consecration of it perhaps more than in listening to the most perfect performance. The reason for so few cantatas being given, especially by the church choral societies, is sometimes economic. Bach's almost invariable practice of writing for 4 soloists makes the works costly to produce. This, however, need be no hindrance. Quite good performances of the cantatas can be given with only 2 soloists, or even 1. The inner connection of the separate numbers of a cantata is often very loose. It is not a crime, therefore, to construct out of the choruses and solos of 4 or 5 cantatas of the same internal spirit a kind of ideal cantata that will fill out the evening, arranging it in such a way that only particular voices, say alto and bass or soprano and tenor, are required for the solos and duets. A performance of this kind ranks much higher artistically than the ordinary one, in which 3 or 4 cantatas are strung together without regard to their textual connection. Of course, there are a number of cantatas that should be produced intact, since they constitute complete religious dramas of ideas. On the other hand, there are dozens, footnote, this refers only to the chorale cantatas of the last period, end footnote, that have so little inner cohesion, and of which the texts are so unequal in quality that a full performance would merely serve to reveal their poetic imperfections. In a cantata made up out of several others, the choruses and chorales will predominate over the solos, and the total picture will be richer and more varied than that of the single Bach cantata. But this ought not to be regarded as a disadvantage. In the last resort we have done nothing more than reach past the uninteresting Neumeister cantata form, which Bach adopted because no one would give him any other texts, to the rich German cantata of an older day. In any case, intelligent musicians everywhere ought to acknowledge the claim that when cantatas are performed together, they should have some kind of poetic connection among themselves, and that even in these unecclesiastical days, the particular church period should not be so disregarded in our programs as it everywhere is at present. Art like Bach's can only make its way as a religious and liturgical barbarity of this kind gradually falls into discredit, and the time will probably come when our concert performances of his music will be arranged in accordance with the season: All Saints' Day, Advent, Christmas, New Year, Epiphany, the Passion, Easter, or Whitsuntide. The Trinity cantatas can be grouped according to definite poetic or religious ideas, or connected with cantatas pertaining to the feast time. There are more specimens in the cantatas than is commonly imagined of simple service music within the capacities of church choirs that would not be equal to Bach as a whole, so that he could be made use of in simple liturgical ceremonies much more frequently than he is at present. This is especially true of the motet-like choruses in the cantatas numbers 2, 8, 12, 28, 37, 38, 64, 116, 118, 121, 144, 150, and 179. They could be given, in case of need, with organ alone or with the addition of a very modest orchestra. Other choruses of a simple kind are the following: Weinen Klagen from number 12, Alle Augen warten her from number 23, Nimm von uns, Herr, from number 101, Das Neugeborn Kindlein from number 121, Meinen Jesum lass ich nicht from number 124, Aus der Tiefe from number 131, Ich will den Namen Gottes from number 142, Wenn es meines Gottes Wille from number 161, Ruhe hochte unseren Geist from number 173, So lasst uns gehen in Salem der Freuden, number 182. Besides these, there are a number of simple or plainly figured chorales with orchestral accompaniment. Fine specimens will be found in the cantatas numbers 1, 15, 22, 23, 24, 29, 33, 46, 75, 76, 79, 98, 99, 101, 105, 107, 109, 113, 124, 133, 138, 142, 147, 167, 171, 172, 173, 186, and 190. The wind instruments in the accompaniment to the chorales in the cantatas numbers 31, 41, and 100 could be replaced by the organ, as the parts are very simple. For use in liturgical services, again, the unison chorale melodies with instrumental accompaniment are appropriate. They could be sung by several good boys' voices. Numbers of this kind will be found in cantatas numbers 6, 36, 51, 85, 86, 92, 95, 130, 140, 143, 166, 178. Further, there are many simple and easy solos that could be put to good use in the church service. For example, O Menschenkind, duet for alto and tenor from number 20, Gott der du die Liebe heißt, duet for tenor and bass from number 33, Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, duet for soprano and alto from number 36, Einzieh dich Heiland, mein Herz der Welt, duet for soprano and alto from number 124, Lass, O Fürst der Cherubim, tenor solo from number 130, Handen, die sich nicht verschleißen, duet for soprano and bass from number 173, Jesu lässt durchvoll und weh, tenor solo from number 182, Barmherziges Herz der ewigen Liebe, duet for soprano and tenor from number 185, Darum sollt ich nie sorgen, bass solo from number 187, Jesus soll mein alles sein, duet for tenor and bass from number 190. Many duets and trios are so simple that, as has already been pointed out, they could be sung by the choir with several voices to each part. For example, Denket der Barmherzigkeit, alto and tenor from number 10, Herrgott warte for soprano and alto from number 37, When meine Trübsal, soprano, alto and bass from number 38, Wir eilen mit Schwachen, soprano and alto from number 78, Gott, ach Gott verlass, soprano and bass from number 79, Ach, wir bekennen, soprano, tenor and bass from number 116, Ist Gott verschont, soprano, alto and tenor from number 122, Zerren müssen von den Winden, alto, tenor and bass from number 150. When the great Bach Gesellschaft edition was being prepared, subscriptions were chiefly expected from the church choirs, but these did not respond. Nor have they as yet done what may be expected of them in the way of performing the cantatas. This was mostly due to the mistaken notion of the conductors that Bach could not be performed in the original form. They waited for the time when the whole of Bach should be issued in an edition for practical use, and meanwhile sat with their hands folded. It is hardly credible that they will continue to hold back in this way. From articles by Seifert, Bach Jahrbuch for 1904, and Voigt, Bach Jahrbuch for 1906, they can learn that they can make the practical arrangement out of the score for themselves to suit the capacity and numbers of their choirs. On the whole, articles of this kind, recounting experiences and giving suggestions for the study and performance of Bach's works, are what is most needed at present. It is desirable that many other Bach experts should contribute to the discussion of this question in the Bach Jahrbuch. What results, for example, might not be hoped for if an aesthetician and practical man like Kretschmar would take a dozen cantatas and discuss in detail everything that concerned the study and performance of them with the modest forces of the ordinary choir? We must not, of course, expect complete agreement upon the many points involved in the performance of Bach's works. We are still in the experimental epoch. But if people will take the experience of others and examine them, form their own opinion of them, and carry them still further, we shall attain to principles that are universally valid, the fruit of all-round examination. Without inquiry and discussion of this kind, there can be no progress. The problem of the correct way of performing Bach can be solved only by artistic experiments conducted with a consciousness of the end in view. But even when we attain to a general understanding as to the technical questions, a diversity of opinion upon the artistic conception will still have to be reckoned with. This will proceed not only from us but from Bach's work itself. Bach, says a distinguished student of him, has at present a Janus head, one face looking back to the epoch of formal architectonic structure, the other turned towards the future, towards the freest subjectivity of inward speech. We cannot help modernizing him. On the other hand, experience has led us back to the point of striving more than ever to bring out the architectonic form. We get a different Bach according as we stress the modern or the formal element in him. It is with Bach's music, Gevaert once wrote, as with the Gospel, we know it only according to Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. The evangelists deviate widely from each other, and yet they give us the Gospel. Anyone who seeks for this in them can find it, and can communicate it to others. So it is with Bach's works. The only thing is that we must seek Bach, not ourselves, in them, and have a reverent consciousness of offering mankind something precious, not only for the artistic sense, but for soul and spirit. Then it is always the true Bach, no matter in how many different ways he sounds. Bach's music depends for its effect not upon the perfection, but upon the spirit of the performance. Mendelssohn, Schellbl, and Moswys, who were the first to waken the Cantatas and Passions to new life, were able to do so because they were not only musicians, but sincere and deep-feeling men. Only he who sinks himself in the emotional world of Bach, who lives and thinks with him, who is simple and modest as he, is in a position to perform him properly. If the director and the performer do not feel themselves in a consecrated mood, they cannot communicate such a mood to the hearer. Something cold will settle upon the music and deprive it of its best strength. One thing is needful, said. End of chapter 35, part 6. The performance of the Cantatas and Passions. End of J.S. Bach, Volume 2, by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman.